Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex and social justice.
With Jessie and PJ Sage. Hello everyone, we are happy to be back with another episode. This week we are excited to bring you an interview with Lola Davina, author of Thriving in Sex Work. We will talk about the current political climate in sex work and how we can protect ourselves from burnout. But first, we're going to talk about an article that I published this week on sex work and motherhood. Hi guys, we are so tired right now. It's Sunday night. We're trying to get this episode out on Monday morning, and we've spent the whole day doing manual labor.
That's true.
We were telling you guys last week, we have this studio that we're trying to make. We have a room that we're trying to turn into a studio for this podcast. And there's this bathroom in there that is lime green right now that we are trying to figure out what to do with. And we're trying to hang these doors, and I don't know, PJ, how many times do we hang the doors?
I don't really know, 5 or 6 or more.
It was kind of a nightmare. It took the entire day. But anyways.
Well, it's because the whole house is crooked. That's the problem. So you're trying to fit straight doors into a crooked frame.
Yeah. We've never talked to you guys
about... I feel
about...
like that's a metaphor for some sort.
Of our life? Yeah, probably is a metaphor of our life. Yeah, we bought this house a year ago and did a ton of renovation, and it has been a total nightmare because everything is crooked. The whole house is slanted in one direction.
Which made it cheap.
Yeah, we could afford to buy it.
We could afford to have a studio.
It's really kind of awesome, except that
is once we fix that room.
But anyways, it's moving along, and we are happy to be with you. And we're just going to update you on some work that we were doing earlier this week. A couple of episodes ago, we did a special on sex work and motherhood, and we got a ton of emails and comments from people who are really interested in that. So last week, I published an article in The Establishment on sex work and motherhood, and we were just going to talk a little bit about that today before we get into the interview with Lola Davina.
Yeah, so I guess you should probably start off by telling folks what the name of your article is and where they can find it.
The title of the article is Your Mother is a Whore, and it's in The Establishment. It's the first piece I've written for The Establishment. They were actually really wonderful.
I mean, this is a really personal piece for you, and you share a lot of your own fears. I know you wrote a number of drafts, and I think it took you a while to actually write yourself into the piece because you did a bunch of interviews with other sex workers.
Yeah, so I decided that I wanted to write this piece for a couple of reasons. One, because I am a mother who does sex work, and two, because of our podcast, the episode that we put out, because it seemed to speak to a lot of people, and three, because we know several people who are going through custody battles with their kids because of the work that they're doing. And as a mom who does sex work, that has been my biggest fear, and the biggest fear of most of my friends who have kids, is that our work is somehow going to paint us as unfit mothers. So I decided that I wanted to tell this story. And so I talked to a lot of mothers who are sex workers. And the first time that I wrote this, in the first couple of drafts that I wrote it, I didn't put myself in it at all. And I think part of that is that it's hard to be this personal. And when I gave it to the editor, she wanted more of my own story in it. So it did. I think I stared at it for like a week before I could figure out how to tell my own story in a way that I was comfortable with.
Yeah, because really what she is asking you to do is wrestle with your deepest, darkest fears, right?
Right. It seemed like a really tall order, but then there was a part of me that was like, that would be fairly hypocritical because all of the people that I interviewed were really, really brave, and they told me their stories. They trusted me with that, and I felt like I owed them something as well.
So you talked to a lot of people who were both sex workers and mothers. What sort of stuck out for you from those conversations?
Well, it's funny because people talked about a lot of things. They talked about their own custody battles. They talked about the fears that they had, particularly when their kids were younger. They talked about how to talk to their kids about the work that they were doing as their kids got older. In short, they talked about a lot of different things, and I didn't know where I was going to go. But the thing that stood out the most to me, the needle that I really wanted to thread in this piece, is that they also talked about how they're raising children in a way that their own children aren't going to have the same attitudes towards sex work and towards sex in general, and the same stigmas that create the culture that makes these mothers afraid in the first place. So the thing that was most striking to me is the way that, not just the way that the mothers were dealing with the outside world, but the way that sex work was changing the way that they mothered, and to my eyes, changing it for the better.
Yeah, that it led to a very active sort of parenting when it came sexuality and shame and stigma, or a very intentional kind of parenting around those issues. One of the things that a lot of mothers you cited in the piece seemed to be running up against was this sense from society that they were assumed to have bad judgment or be unfit in some way, when in fact they were being really, really conscious and intentional about how they were parenting.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that there was a couple of women in the piece who said that their kids aren't old enough to really understand what sex work is. I mean, you have to have a sense of what sex is first, but that they thought that they were laying a foundation. One of them actually said really specifically that she thought that she was laying a foundation so that when her kids were high school age or something like that, and they found out that she did porn for a living, they would understand why she would make that choice. And they talked about all of these smaller moves. They talked to their kids about consent and who's allowed to touch their body and who's not allowed to touch their body. They didn't shame their kids for having their own sorts of desires. They talked to their kids about people with different sexual orientations or different family configurations, or normalized sexuality in a way that was, first of all, like age appropriate, but second of all, allowed for kind of an expansive worldview.
So I guess what you gleaned from all of that is that that kind of proactive, intentional parenting when it comes to these topics of consent and sex work is itself a form of activism. Like, we so often think about activism just as being like marching in the streets or like signing petitions, but that kind of radical intentionality within parenting is also like a form of activism. I think that's a big thing that came out in the piece.
Yeah. So one of the women that I interviewed told a story that I thought really typified what you're saying. Her name is Yin Q, and she's a dominatrix. And she has a series of videos called Mercy Mistress where she's dressed up in character. And her young kids have seen footage, like age-appropriate footage of her while she was putting together this series of videos, and asked, what does this character do? And she said, oh, this character allows people to face their darkness. And one of her little daughters said, so she's a superhero. And I thought that was a really great story, but also really interesting because there's a way in which she's laying a foundation for rethinking and reimagining what it is that a sex worker is for a younger generation, and that this sort of kind of radical culture shift, and you get culture shift and you get change through the activism on the streets. But I think that one of the things that was so interesting in all of these stories is that this radical activism for a lot of these mothers started at home with their kids.
So I think we kind of summed up the gist of the piece. Is there anything else you wanted to highlight before we do our interview with Lola?
I talked to a sex worker who isn't a mother herself, but who is the daughter of a sex worker. Probably a lot of you know her, Ramona Flower. And one of the things that I thought was really great about that is that she talked about how she's been standing up for sex workers and for sex worker rights since she was really young, because for as long as she remembers, her mom was a sex worker. So I felt really lucky to be able to include the story of a daughter who grew up with a sex working mother and who felt grateful for that experience because it shaped her sense of social justice. And, you know, I feel proud to be a mom, and I hope that I'm doing the same thing for my kids. And I got the sense when I talked to all the moms that I interviewed that they're doing that. And I'm just grateful for the work that they're doing and for the fact that they were willing to share it with me.
All right. Well, I think that's great. Let's go ahead and move on to our interview now.
Sounds good. Lola Davina has spent more than 25 years in and around the sex industry, working as a stripper, dominatrix, porn actress, and escort over a 15-year period. She's earned an MA in human sexuality and an MS in nonprofit fundraising, and writes a self-care and wellness column for whynotcam.com. Welcome, Lola.
Hi there. The part of my bio that I'm most proud of and that I would really love to highlight is that I'm the author of Thriving in Sex Work, Heartfelt Advice for Staying Sane in the Sex Industry.
Which is actually why we had you on.
So I thought I'd bring it up. That really is my life's work, culmination of all of my experience. So I just want to shout that out while we're here, because that was really, it was an important book for me to write, and it was really my love letter to the sex industry and everyone who works in it. So,
and we were really excited about it and have been reading through it, and also know how impactful it's been on our community. And that's exactly why we did want to bring you on, especially because, in the wake of Fosta Sesta, and then Jessie and I have both been working for weeks now on this campaign here locally in Pittsburgh where condoms have been criminalized.
Oh my God, I've been seeing that. It just takes me all the way back to the 80s again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really horrible and really retrograde or something.
Absolutely. But here we are again, criminalizing people for being sexual, walking while sexual, I guess, breathing while sexual. I don't know.
Yeah.
Good Lord. We haven't learned anything about safer sex
exactly.
Oh my God,
you'd think that at this point, we'd have more of a public health mindset, and we'd understand that everybody's affected by these issues. We should care about everybody's health, but even the more cynical view is like kind of the herd mentality thing where, if some people are getting sick, then we're all getting sick, but none of that. We're somehow trapped back into the decades ago thinking.
I always sort of think of these things in generational terms, right? So I'm 50 years old. I have to presume that the vast majority of policymakers are my age or within a decade of, maybe a decade younger, a decade older, right? These are people who have grown up during the AIDS crisis, who were awake and alive, and were reading the headlines when these things were happening. This isn't I don't mean to disparage millennials or people who are, say, in their 20s and 30s, but I do have people who are, say, 15 years younger than I am who don't think about the AIDS crisis in the same way because it just simply wasn't their experience.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
But thinking about this specific policy issue, it's like, you got to figure the police chief, the heads of, public health and safety,
the district attorney, all of these people.
These all have to be people who lived through the AIDS crisis, and you want to criminalize condoms? This is what you're talking about. Really, people.
Yeah. My heart tells me that, I absolutely agree with you, and my heart tells me that unfortunately it's a reversion to they deserve it kind of thinking, which was also exactly the problem in the 1980s.
It certainly was. Now, I don't know, and I'm just going to ask you guys, do you think that this is one of those laws that they put on the books to enforce only when they want to enforce it? Basically, it's like jaywalking where everybody looks the other way until they find somebody that they want to hassle, and then they would use a statute like this in order to bust people?
No, the reason that they're doing it is because it's a higher level misdemeanor, so it trumps up charges. So if you use a condom as an instrument of crime, so prostitution by itself is just a first degree misdemeanor, and you would just ticket people and they'd get a summons and they would come back. But if you have an instrument of crime, then you automatically get booked into jail, fingerprints get taken, and then they use those as
leverage.
To incite pleas.
Yeah, to get a plea bargain. And I think the other issue that's at play is that all of the trafficking rhetoric right now, there's a lot of top-down political pressure, political pressure from federal lawmakers who are putting pools of money out there and to pay for policing around sex work. And there's a lot of pressure for these county level police departments to be making certain numbers and showing that they're quote unquote enhancing their policing of trafficking. But what that really means is just cracking down on independent sex workers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then saying that they're doing something related to trafficking when it has absolutely nothing to do with trafficking, and trafficking is just a smokescreen for vice stings, basically.
Oh, I mean, I was aware of the headlines of this, but now that you've explained it to me, it makes me even angrier. This is so we're going to criminalize safer sex. we're going to turn people into criminals for engaging in and lump them into trafficking if they're engaging in safer sex.
Yes.
Great. That's great news. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at. But I want to say, this is why we wanted to have you on, because after months of agitating against FOSTA SESTA and then months of agitating against these horrible condom criminalization practices, we're honestly feeling pretty burnout. And it's just hard. It's hard out there doing sex work activism. It's scary out there being a sex worker right now. And we've sort of decided to do a month of more positive interviews. And we couldn't think of anyone more perfect to kick off that month than you. So that's why we wanted to bring you in to talk about your book.
I just have to say that it's been interesting. The last few months, I've had a different relationship to my book than I did when I wrote it.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a different environment, right? And, looking at the advice that I gave, looking at the messages that I wanted to put out there, and now filtering it through this considerably darker, considerably more trying time, I probably would have written a different book had I started writing it today.
Yeah.
Than I did, 4.5 or 5 years ago when I was working on it. I do think some of the messages of it are foundational. That we kind of the only person on earth that we have direct control over is our own selves.
Right.
Kind of self-care, self-monitoring, tools for resilience, tools for letting go of things that we don't have any power over. These are really, really foundational, important, especially for anyone who does a lot of emotional labor, which of course is what sex work is. Yeah, and it is a very trying time. The huge amount of burnout. There's burnout in the wider world with all the dumpster fires that are going on, just broader
everywhere, the
landscape. But yes, now I think it has really gobsmacked a lot of sex workers that we kind of felt like nobody was. SESTA FOSTA caught a lot of people off guard. That there have been such significant inroads in conflating consensual and voluntary and survival sex work with trafficking. It's just been sort of breathtaking how fast that has spread like wildfire at the federal level, even among Democrats, which has just been a huge source of disappointment for a lot of people. There just doesn't seem to be any voice of anybody who's looking at sex work as voluntary, as necessary, as
worthwhile,
as victimless crime,
Right. Or what you said, I think importantly, even conceptualizing in any meaningful way the emotional labor that is such a dominant part of what sex work actually is. And I think if we did frame it that way, we might talk about sex work
entirely differently.
Exactly.
Yes. Wouldn't that be amazing? Yeah. To think about the fact that as human beings, life is very long, that as we go through life, our bodies change, our circumstances change, and that we can't always get the sex that we want or the sexuality that we want. I tend to think in terms of sexuality because I think about porn, I think about camming, I think about not just direct in real life, but thinking that our sexual imaginations, our desire for variety, our desire to be turned on by something outside of our own imaginations, these are things that most of us want, at least at some point in our lives. And it is very troubling to think that even with the expansion and normalization and demystification of sex work on so many different levels, that we're now finding ourselves in this ferocious backlash environment where it is very, like you say, very dangerous, very difficult, very hard.
Do you think that that's connected? Do you think the fact that sex work started to gain some sort of normalcy or something, do you think that that's part of the reason that there's this backlash?
I remain a bit mystified by the mechanism for how the anti-trafficking lobby managed to make its way through Congress so quickly. You think about how fast SESTA and FOSTA, just in terms of legislative agendas, how fast it made it through. Yeah.
When they can't hardly manage to put anything through.
Right.
It's really amazing.
I'm not a student of this kind of policy. It's not really been my focus. I've sort of been dragged along with this as part of this, just being an observer of the sex industry as a whole. So I feel like I'm running to catch up to learn about a lot of these things. Count me gobsmacked, though, because I was really I've been operating under the worldview for a long time that sex work has become more normalized and has become more diffuse. Yeah. More and more people are. My joke is that anybody under the age of 25 is online right now, either jerking off or watching somebody else jerk off. I mean, like, everyone's camming right now. It's just what people do. I think maybe that's why the birth rates are dropping. We just don't need to actually have sex with each other anymore. That's a joke. But yeah.
And we're all hopelessly in debt and can't find jobs. That too. But it's funny because it's kind of a little bit true. And yet at the same time, we're seeing this other thing happening with just this vicious backlash. And again, the conflation of any kind of voluntary sex work with trafficking, that there's an equal sign between those two things. There's no discussion of coercion, violence, kidnapping, holding onto people's passports. None of that. We're just not going to discuss that. All we're going to talk about is the sex. We're not going to talk about violence or coercion. It's just...
That's the interesting thing, I think, about talking to anyone outside of the sex industry about what our jobs are like, is I think that sex overshadows everything and nobody can think past that. And it's so interesting to me because sex feels like actually such a small part of it. I can't speak to everybody's experiences and people run their businesses differently, but it seems to me that people are looking for a lot of things, that sex is a way of getting other needs met.
I think that's beautifully stated. In fact, I got a little shiver when you said it that way. Yes, I think there's plenty of sex work which is purely a physical release. It's there's not a lot of, I'm thinking about porn for, specifically. Basically, you want to watch people fuck or be naked or do, stick things in their butt or whatever you're going to do. Right. And that's fine. And that's an image that incites a response, and that turns you on and gets you off. But it's so much.
But it might also make you feel better about your own body at the same time.
Well, thank you for saying that too. I mean, yes, you're right. This operates on lots and lots of different levels, right? I mean, it is a profoundly human experience to be sexual and to experience and to crave other people's sexuality. And you're right. There's a lot to be learned. There's a lot to be exchanged. Yeah, and just knowing that maybe your kink is shared by somebody else, or maybe it's not the weirdest thing you've ever seen out there, or maybe your imagination's running pretty dry, so you want to be inspired by something outside of yourself. I keep saying that the limits of exploration, the horizon, the frontier of imaginings of both sexuality and gender are not happening in Hollywood. Hollywood is 20 to 30 years behind the curve. If you want to see where the imagination is flourishing around sexuality and gender, it is in the sex industry. That is where you are seeing people of different bodies, of different genders, of different orientations. This is where the imagination is exploding. And you're just seeing...
I absolutely agree.
Yeah. I mean, I'm online all day and I just look at my Twitter feed and I just see people doing the most amazing things. And
it's so interesting because I do a lot of writing and I've been interviewing people for the articles that I write. And the story that I keep hearing over and over again that people outside of the industry don't hear is that doing sex work gave me some sort of acceptance of my body that I didn't have before. It allowed me to feel normal or feel accepted
or feel beautiful or
feel beautiful.
Powerful. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And that comes across over and over again. I just had somebody write me this really amazing message after I interviewed her for an article on BBW stuff that said, after I thought about it, after having this conversation, I started to realize that I follow all of these other BBW models because I realized that I find them beautiful, and it allowed for a self-acceptance of, a self-acceptance. And that's amazing to me.
I think it's wonderful. I see so much of that in the trans community. I see so much of older sex workers. People with their own specific fetishes. It's yeah, and it could be something that's it can be something as simple as like, I have always felt ashamed about insert body part, and then my clients made me realize that was exactly why they wanted to see me or why they wanted to engage with me.
After 2 years or so of doing dissertation interviews, I have heard that same phrase, repeated over and over and over again, probably 20 or 30 times in interviews. That is such a common experience among sex workers, that they find that sort of validation regarding their body or some other aspect of their sexuality within their work, that they find that there are people who really love the thing that they were most self-critical of.
But then you have all of the anti-sex work rhetoric, though, that's like, but what about the sex? But what about the sex? And that feels so foreign in my ear, given the immense nuance in the way in which sex workers talk about their work that gets totally flattened when people outside of sex work talk about sex work.
I always try to hold compassion for the antis. I always think in their minds, right? I don't know. I'm just kind of projecting into their minds. I mean, what they're imagining is people in very, very, very atrocious circumstances where people are experiencing violence. They've been kidnapped. They don't have the freedom to leave where they are or talk to people who speak their language, or they're seeing clients against their will. They're engaging in sex acts against their will. And that is horrifying. And I mean, fortunately, there are laws there to prosecute the people who engage in that. But it does shut down the imagining for the possibility that anyone could engage in this work consensually. And I do want to kind of tie this back to self-care, because I do think this is so important. And thinking about just everyone I talk to is so burned out and really suffering and really struggling. I would counsel people to think about the ways that sex work really feeds them, the things that they love about it. We're talking about the validation. If that means keeping a gratitude journal, if that means every day just making note of something that they love about their work, it can be in the midst of these very trying times when it feels like we're being attacked from all sides. This is self-knowledge, right? These are things that we know to be true. We know that sex work can be life-affirming. We know it can be real connection. We know it can be inspirational and energizing and creative and validating and beautiful. These are the things that we have to focus on because other people aren't going to do it for us. So that there's some of that, and just going back to that well of deep self-knowledge of saying, look, I know the world doesn't love this job, and I know that there's stigma and hostility attached to it, but I know what it can be. I know why I do it. I know why I love it. And it's not that way every day. And sometimes you get burned out and you have horrible clients and you think, why did I do this? But
that's with every job, though.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Yeah. Every creative job. Yeah. And all the other jobs suck. So, yeah, exactly.
And with every human being, right? We're not all these paragons of stability. We all have our own cycles and our own demons or whatever. And we have to, we all feel down sometimes.
Right. But so another thing I would talk about and I would counsel is that we have to be kind to the people who are closest to us. We have to rely on our networks of people who can support us and re-energize us and inspire us. And I love that story about, being a BBW and saying, I've got a Twitter feed full of people who reaffirm the beauty of this body type. And, I definitely encourage people. I know part of this job is being online all day and having to interact with folks, is definitely cultivate your joy, right? Don't get in fights with people. Just block them and move on. rely heavily on the people who really motivate you and inspire you, and just kind of practicing that good mental hygiene, right? Like,
right.
Because certainly the internet is a delivery system for arousal, and whether that's anger or sexual arousal or, kitties,
right.
you get to decide what it's going to be, right?
I love that.
Yeah, so definitely choose
I love
wisely.
the meme that you put up yesterday with the pill bottle with the little
the dogs
with the
coming out of
little
it. Yeah, like the prescription. Yeah,
yeah, that was very cute.
Just have like little fur prescription fur love on demand. But yeah, and that's something I've had to definitely learn. I'm terrible if somebody wants to pick a fight with me. My knee-jerk reaction is to always kind of fall into that. But I've had to, over time, just kind of say, you know what? I don't really think I need to fight with you today. I can just block you and move on.
I'm pretty good at that. I tend to not engage in arguments online, but that doesn't mean that I don't get irritated by stuff.
Right.
I'm good at not engaging, but I'm not good at not, getting worked
riled
up about it.
Yeah.
Before our time is up, I did want to dive into the book a little bit.
Sure.
I wanted to do a little deep diving because there are a couple things that I think we found really interesting in the book. One of the things was the discussion of aging and aging out, because that's something that comes up so often in talking to sex workers, and you've had a lot of experience in the industry.
Well, I would say, painting in kind of a broad brush, and I talk about this some in the book, if you work for somebody else, there's always churn. That's true in the porn industry, that's true in stripping, it's true when the possibilities and the potential to age into your 30s, into your 40s, into your 50s, and into your 60s in the sex industry are when you work for yourself, right? When you cultivate your own clientele. And that lends you necessarily to certain job titles. Camming's a good one, escorting and,
phone sex,
professional domination. Yes.
Yeah.
So these are the, and actually if you make your own porn, there's plenty of people who make their own porn too.
Sure.
So, yeah, very interesting to me how ferociously we police age in the sex industry, and yet there are so many people who are just going right ahead and working into their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. They're just doing it. They're just doing it, and they're just being that age.
Yeah.
And just think there's a lot of different reasons for that. I think we are... Now that, again, thinking about the sex industry as a place where our sexual imagination can run wild rather than Hollywood, we're just seeing so many people be different ages, be different body types, and just be sexual. And there's a market for that.
That's beautiful, I think.
Yeah, it's something that I've seen happen in my lifetime. I think part of the reason why I think so much of this is around social media. There were, when I was working, I knew women who were 10 and 15 and 20 years older than me, but they were few and far between. But now that you can see the universe, the ocean of people online, I do see so many people of all different body types and all different representations and doing the work. So, just kind of general advice. It's like, don't let your imagination limit you. If this is work that you feel like you can continue to do as you grow older, think about that. If that's how you want to do it. Connection and personality and warmth and a good sense of humor are going to be qualities that you're going to need as you get older. And have older clients yourself. But yeah, the sexual imagination is not just for younger people. Yeah. Well, one of my favorite statistics is somebody did some big meta study of the porn search words, and the two top porn search words were BBW and MILF. Yeah. And it's like, there's a hunger out there for things that are different than what Hollywood tells us we are supposed to be attracted to from a knee-jerk response. So yeah, I continue to welcome this broadening of the sexual imagination for sure.
Yeah.
So one more question I had about the book, a section I found really interesting was the way you talked about realness and authenticity. And I've never heard anyone quite break it down like that. I thought it was super insightful. If I can put you on the spot, Could you break that down for us?
Sure. Well, it's subtle, right? I mean, so I start from the premise that there's a huge craving for the real, that clients are craving the real, right?
Right.
Real boobs, real tan, real names, real orgasms. It's just, and basically it's this kind of fundamental core insecurity, right? Like, I want to be sexual with you or in your vicinity or around you or be aroused by you. Are you real? Can I reach out and touch something that isn't fake, right? This is foundational. This is pretty pure emotional stuff that there's a anxiety that's produced. It's an uncanniness, right? If you feel like you're not connecting with someone when you're really aroused and really turned on, and the thought that somehow that they're completely checked out or they're not there with you somehow, right?
Right, yeah.
And that could be gendered. There's kind of some interesting stuff around that when you think about it gender-wise. But so there's this craving for the real. As sex workers, sometimes we're not going to give people the real, right? Yeah. And that there can be all different kinds of reasons for that. We're just not into the person that we're interacting with, or we're just not feeling it that day, or there's just certain parts of ourselves that just aren't for sale.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that you can't give the term that I use is something that is authentic. And I kind of liken that to an actor.
Right.
Who goes through the motions. If you ever go to a play, it's like, if you don't understand what's going on, like if you arrived from Mars and you're like, okay, so why is this person behaving this way? This is like really like, this is bizarre behavior because this person is in this weird trance and doing all this stuff. But as audience members, we're rapt, right? We can be transported. We can feel these amazing things in the presence of this person's authentic performance, tapping into places that, ordinarily we don't go to. So I used to think in terms when I was working, especially when I was, doing full service sex work, but in other ways too, that I would tap into my authenticity, if not necessarily my realness, right? This is an artificial situation. I wasn't going to tell these people my real name. I wasn't going to tell them my partner's name or there were like lots of doors that were closed. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that you can't tap into this place of deep authenticity where you can really connect, really engage, and be totally present with another person. I don't know. It was just my way of thinking about it. I don't know if that's helpful for everyone, but I kind of wanted to break that down because I think there is this knee-jerk reaction to that uncanny place. And it's like you need a way to conceptualize it, how you work your way through that.
No, I was going to say that the way that you're talking about this is deeply resonant with me because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I mean, I actually primarily do phone sex, and I have had the same sort of experience where clients have wanted to ask me, like, do you feel this too? Are you also aroused? And or are you in? It's often with phone sex clients, like, are you also into this particular thing? Because a lot of people who have kinks want to call into phone sex lines because they don't actually want to play something out, but in real life, but they want to play out the fantasy, right?
That's a really good point. Of course, that makes perfect sense. It's a safe way to explore it, knowing there's no way you're ever going to do it, right?
Yeah, but there's something really interesting about that push of like, oh, but do you like that or would you want that? And oftentimes it's not something that I'm into, or but that doesn't mean that I can't, from a place of empathy, like see why they're very much into it and then use that to think about the things in my life, to kind of come into a place of like deep feeling about things that really drive me. I don't know if this is making a whole bunch of sense, but but there's a way in which those feelings are authentic, even though I'm not in real life into the thing that they're talking about at that moment.
Well, I've got a good girlfriend who was an escort for more than 20 years, and she talks a lot about sexual aikido or sexual jujitsu, where she may have been presented with a client that she was not actually aroused by, right? This is not, this person would not be the person she would choose to be her partner again in quote unquote real life, right?
Sure, right.
But she could, first of all, through that person's attraction to her, she could generate her own heat. Yeah. And then she could also draw on the wellspring of her own erotic charge to get to a place where she genuinely enjoyed the exchange, right?
Right.
There was this genuine level of like, I am enjoying myself. I'm here with you. I'm going to ask you to do things the way that I like them. And she was saying that's a really important gift. That's a really important skill, right?
Yeah.
To be able to be intimate and sexual with someone, even if they're not your cup of tea.
But to authentically be able to move into a space where you have this shared experience that even if you're drawing it off of your own life and that's not made explicit in any particular way, I think that it cannot be real in the way that somebody wants to press you as to whether this is a real experience, but it can be authentic. That makes total sense to me, what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, it was one of those things I was actually a little bit reticent about even including, because I thought, is this too meta? Is this helpful to anyone but me? So I'm glad that
we're kind of into meta.
Yeah.
We're just the kind of meta nerds that this would speak to.
Yes, meta sex nerds, meta sex workers. But yeah, I mean, it is just one of these things where I think, oh my God, if you could just sit every client in the world down and have this conversation, just be like, look, this is how it is. Yes, you're paying me. Yes.
Yeah.
No, maybe, drinking milk out of a shoe isn't my thing, but I am right there with you, right?
Yeah.
Because we're both human beings and I'm going to be there with you. That's your thing. And I'm happy to be here with you while that turns you on. And I got my own thing that turns me on, and we're going to be here together. We're going to occupy this space and occupy this space together.
And it's so nice to be able to share the experience with someone, regardless of what the particular contents of the experience are.
Right.
And I mean, I think there's a way in which a lot of sex workers practice a radical kind of empathy or curiosity that doesn't always have to be self-focused, but that you were saying earlier, appreciate someone else's excitement or what's turning them on, and being there in that moment. I mean, of course, you're not trying to lose yourself in the moment. You also have to be grounded to why that makes sense for you or is rewarding to you. But I do think that there is a certain kind of engagement where you can be authentic with a person, like you're saying, or allow your personality to show through in that moment, even if they don't know everything about you, even if this isn't exactly the thing you would do if it wasn't a transactional context. But that doesn't mean you can't be engaged in some meaningful way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess this is too abstract a conversation. There's no movement around this, right? There's no political movement around this. But I think that one of the core knocks or the core ickiness that people have around the sex industry is exactly on this specific question, which is that the notion that somehow because it's transactional, it's not quote unquote real sex. And that's driven by anti-sex work people just in general. It freaks them out. It's the hostility that a lot of the clients bring to the table, this somehow notion that they're bringing their authentic selves to these transactions, and what they're getting is just kind of garbage in return. They're getting empty
sentiment
exchanges.
or something.
Yeah, people just going through the motions. And I'm sure there are plenty of sex workers who are not having authentic, they're not
absolutely
completely. They're going through the motions, and it's robotic and it's pretty empty. But there are plenty of sex workers who are available to be present authentically. Plenty. And those are folks if you have the gift of being able to offer, like you say, that kind of radical empathy, I think you should be doing this work. I think you should be paid for it handsomely, because I think it's a gift. I really do. And I wish there was some way to kind of expand people's ideas around that. But I'm afraid it's just going to have to happen one person at a time. I don't think there's a political movement.
Yeah, I love that idea of it being a gift. It kind of harkens back to the beginning of your book when you're introducing yourself and you talk about feeling like you were called to sex work. And I hear a lot of people, I actually feel that way too, that when I got into this work, it made sense, in ways that other things that were leading up to it didn't, because I was much older. I got into it much older. But I love that idea of this being a gift that some people are called to.
Absolutely. And, of course, my vision for, some kind of sex work utopian future where there are people who are doing it because they're good at it, because they like it, and that people come to it. When I go out and get a massage, I'm really excited. I'm going to the spa. I'm going to get a massage. It's yay, I love my masseuse. It's wonderful to be touched. They could bring that level of this is just a joyful exchange. This is what our bodies crave.
Right.
And just lift all of this shame and stigma off of it. I mean, I know that is a long way off. And I know there's plenty of sex work that doesn't look like that, but that is what I would hope for the future, for sure.
Yeah. So before we go, I wanted to ask, so going back to why we wanted to have you on in the first place. So for people who are experiencing burnout in this political climate, what sort of advice do you have for them?
Right. This kind of outrage fatigue and just fatigue around so many, just the fact that the environment has become so much more difficult in such a short period of time. Well, it's so many of the core precepts that I have in the book. I would say, again, starting foundationally, just going back to basics, which is just to say, be aware of how you're feeling. Don't stuff that down. Don't push that away. If you're feeling exhausted, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling tired or outraged, there are different ways to deal with each of those mental states. But foundation, it's being present with them, letting yourself feel them, breathing your way through them.
Yeah.
If it's anger, maybe you need to express that through your body. If it's sadness, maybe you need to have a good cry, or you need to talk to someone trusted who can hold that sadness for you. Maybe you need to journal. Maybe you need to make art around it. I think that we don't, or at least here in the West, we don't learn how to sit with our emotions and experience them completely. So we have a lot of partially digested emotions kind of rattling around in our bodies.
Yeah.
That's very exhausting, and it does contribute to both mental and physical exhaustion and burnout. So a lot of the techniques in the book are breath-based. They are mindfulness-based. And then there's kind of the sense of, once you've kind of worked it through your body and your mind, then is there some other activity past that to kind of discharge it or to use that energy? So whether it's making art or exercising or engaging socially, or going out and finding a dog in the park and asking some owner if you can just let it sit on your lap for 5 minutes because you just need to interact with an animal. That we need to take care of ourselves around this. It's like one day after the other of feeling outraged and misunderstood and persecuted. This is exhausting. We need to take care of ourselves around it, for sure. But that means feeling it, not checking out, right? Not pushing it away with video games or substances, or it means actually having to sit with the feels. And that takes practice. That's hard work.
That was one of the things that I really liked about the way that you set up the book as well, because I feel like for sex work advocates, we spend so much of our time trying to rewrite the narratives of what sex work is. And that almost pushes people to, or it doesn't almost, I think it does push people who are doing this sort of work into not acknowledging the things that are really difficult as like a counterbalance to the anti-sex work rhetoric. And I think that what you did at the beginning of the book by laying out, actually, there are things that are really difficult for people who are doing sex work. And we ought to acknowledge those. And only from acknowledging those can we move forward.
Right. Can we master them, right? Yes, it is certainly... It always seems to come back to the political, but there is a sense that, like, if you talk about the things that are hard, that somehow that's ammunition for the anti-sex working people. Like, so there's pressure to always paint the rosiest picture, or not talk about the things that are hard or scary or disgusting or demoralizing. Yeah. So I took this kind of radical honesty approach, which is just to say, look, the only way that you're going to do well in this work is if you are clear-eyed about what you like about it and what you don't, and have techniques for dealing with the shitty days, as well as leaning into the things that you like best about it. Just kind of having a clear-eyed view of that. So the other thing I would just say too is that, especially again in this very, very toxic age we're living in, is just monitor the amount of toxicity you're letting into your life. If being online or taking in world news is a burden, you need to, I'm not saying disengage altogether, but just be mindful of how much you take in on a given day, especially around stuff you cannot control. We need to be engaged citizens, and we need to be informed, but spending hours and hours and hours online getting really worked up, it doesn't do anybody any good. So
that's what we're working on this month.
Yeah.
But So I think we do have to wrap up, but I wanted to say what I did appreciate about this conversation, just that it's really validating to hear you say that things have kind of taken a dark turn.
They have. There's no question.
And I think for those of us who maybe haven't been in the industry as long as you have, we kind of thought that was true, but on the other hand, there's part of you that's just like, am I totally naive? Has it been like this the whole time?
Has it always been like this? No,
so it is helpful.
This is as dark as it's been for me as a sex radical adventure, whatever the hell I've been over the years. This is getting towards AIDS crisis level darkness as far as I'm now.
Yeah.
The AIDS crisis was its own thing. And,
sure.
That's with a lot of caveats around it, but darkness around it is the only thing I have in my lifetime to approach it is that.
Yeah. I mean, and as much as that sucks, there's something that's sort of freeing about knowing that, because you're like, okay, well, then I'm legitimate or validated and feeling as shitty as I feel about this.
Yeah. But I will just say, too, though, I see a level of feistiness and pushback and people who are refusing to be cowed. Sex workers. I mean, even in this very dangerous and difficult climate, there's a feistiness that I have. I don't know. It does make me hopeful in the long run.
Yeah, it is heartening. It feels like there's really a movement galvanizing. And people are stepping up, and people are.
Yeah, I was just talking to Swap National or Swap USA about their new board of directors. Applications just went out because they're getting new people for the board. And they said that they've actually never had as many people apply for the board positions as they have this year. And I thought that was interesting, that there's this movement toward engagement, toward political action, toward sex work advocacy that has a wider reach than previous.
I completely agree. And I would credit social media for that, because they're just when I was working in the 90s and stuff like that, there was no way to connect with people. Everything was underground.
Right.
So I think when there is a high degree of visibility for communities like ours, marginalized communities like ours, there is that sense that there are a lot of us out there. As I'm always fond of reminding everyone, for every sex worker, there's got to be at least one order, if not two order of magnitudes of clients behind it, right? 10,
for sure.
Maybe 1,000. Yes, how many people, for every person who's on cam, how many tens or hundreds or thousands of people are watching them or engaging with them? How many clients are there out there? And to me, one day, it's this flip in consciousness where all of a sudden clients wake up and say, hey, people want to take away my porn. Hey, people want to take away my strippers. Hey, people want to take away my escorts. I like those things in my life. Get your filthy mitts off them.
Right.
When does that consciousness arrive? But I live to see it. So
I hope. I think we just have to convince them to not feel the shame around it too.
Thank you for saying it. You've just said a big mouthful right there. Because it's not even funny. I mean, I think the amount of shame that clients carry is the problem with this industry. That is it. That is core. That is foundational. That is it right there. That's what keeps all this in the shadows. It's what makes the violence and the rage, so endemic.
Yeah.
It's the shame.
Yeah. Well, it was really good to talk to you. Where can people find you?
Oh, goodness. Well, they can certainly always find me at loladavina.com, LOLADAVINA. My mug is all over that. And I'm most active on Twitter. I love being over on Twitter. As long as Twitter is going to let sex workers do their thing, you're going to find me there. So
that's my favorite platform too.
And I'm over on Facebook. I'm friendly. Please drop me a DM if you'd like to be friends. I'm very friendly.
Okay.
So I just would, the only other thing I would just love to point out is I do have a workbook that's also available, and the audiobook. God help me if I ever finish recording it. It should be out this fall. I'm working on it every day, reading Thriving in Sex Work out loud. So hopefully that will be available by Christmas time, if not before.
Great.
So people can take it in that way too.
And we'll be sharing those links as they come out, for sure.
Thank you so much. Please have me back. I love talking to you guys. You guys are you're so well-spoken and fun to chat with.
That's very sweet of you.
It was really fun. I love this.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.